You'll know when you have a wild woman. She'll practice her craft without boundaries. She is truly autonomous. Her loyalty is only to the family she serves, a midwife who will not allow herself to be held back by a system she didn't create.
This podcast is for the birth keepers who want to grow and change. We are open to learning through self-reflection and supportive community. We are creating this space to explore without judgment. We are remembering we were
Born wild. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Born Wild podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Sophia. Leah is sleeping in because she was at a late birth. But today I have with me Georgeanne Chapin. Georgeanne Chapin has dedicated her life to promoting human rights and fighting injustice. She is a leader in a growing national movement to end routine circumcision of baby boys. 12 years ago, she founded and became executive director of Intact America, the largest national organization working to end child genital cutting in this country and to ensure healthy sexual futures for all people. And I am so excited to have you on today because this is our first time really having an episode dedicated to circumcision. We have mentioned it briefly in other episodes, but it's such an awkwardly important topic to talk about, and people don't want to talk about it. So thank you for coming on to talk about this with us.
Well, it's my great pleasure. Thank you for having me. And of course, one of the things that we want to fight against is the fact that this is an awkward topic. It shouldn't be awkward. It comes up in half of your births, right?
Yeah.
And half of all births, the desire to talk about it is there, and we need to be really clear and plain language and upfront about what it entails, and not embarrass people, not encourage their embarrassment, which is, I think, what the medical profession sometimes does. You know, we're not going to talk about this. So anyway, thank you so much.
Yeah. I started researching it because it was just one of the many topics on my doula list when I became a doula. You know, I was just like checking off the list and researching everything. And I was like, well, I don't really know what it is. I know it has to do with the penis and about it being cleaner. And I watched a video and just like burst into tears. I felt like I was having a panic attack, and I was like, wait, what? Why are we doing this? And that's why when I went down the rabbit hole of information, but I remember when I found the information, it was really easy to find online. And I was like, oh my gosh, parents are going to be so relieved when I give them this information. And they weren't. Not many were. I almost felt like they were mad at me for giving them information.
For making their life too complicated.
I felt so confused. I was like, wait, I thought you would be so happy. Like, oh my gosh, I'm so grateful to have this information, knowing I don't have to hurt my baby this way. And it was really confusing that it was not that. So yeah, I'd love to hear a little bit of how you got involved in this topic, and yeah, just like advice for parents. I was sharing with you when we were not recording that the most common reason, which it's not common, but the most common reason babies in our practice end up circumcised is usually it's their first home birth, their other two were hospital, they've got boys, their first boys were circumcised, mom doesn't really want to, dad really does because he is and the boys are. So if a baby in our practice is circumcised, it's usually that reason.
Well, first I'll address your last comment then, and then I'll tell you a little bit about how I got involved in this movement. It's so interesting to me that argument is used, or that justification is used to cut a body part off of a third child. If you think about any other wound or birth defect or unfortunate thing that might have happened to the father or the siblings, parents would never want to duplicate that in a subsequent child, right? So for example, if you have a child who's born with with one eye or an eye that's very damaged. You wouldn't damage the eye of the second child or the third child so he'll look like his sibling.
And I think
then,
probably comes back to the father then feeling like he's damaged.
Right. Well, correct. Or just that it's unnecessary, right? So why would you do that? But also children look different from their parents in a million ways. So you wouldn't give back a child or do retina implants or cornea or whatever it would be because a child had different color eyes from their parents. Some children are born, much fairer skin or much darker skin than their parents. You don't know if your child's going to be short or tall, or if they're going to be hairy or hairless, as they get older. I mean, not to mention the baby's genitals never look like an adult male's genitals. So that is a kind of a reason, it's like a decision searching for a rationalization rather than a real important consideration. So sometimes giving those kinds of examples is helpful. I mean, I used to just go, well, that's a stupid reason, but you can't really approach it that way. So the way I became involved was really, I just naturally and involuntarily was exposed to circumcision damage when my young brother was born. I was almost 11, and nobody used the word circumcision. I don't think we'd ever use the word penis in my household. But I remember seeing, this beautiful, smooth child with a, obviously wounded penis. But I'm not sure that would have stuck with me necessarily, but he subsequently, a few days later, had to be taken in an emergency back to the doctor so they could reopen the meatus, the hole to his urethra, because it had closed up. And that is a complication from circumcision that's a complication called meatal stenosis that only occurs in circumcised boys and men. And it can occur later in life also. It's unheard of, virtually unheard of. Somebody will say, well, there's 1 in 1,000 cases or 1 in 10,000 cases. Unheard of in intact men. It's pure, and the reasons for it are contested. Some people say that it's from the abrasion against the diaper that causes it to get inflamed and close up. Another explanation, which to me makes more sense, especially if it happens in a little tiny baby, is that the nerves and the blood vessels get rearranged when you cut off part of the penis, and so the tissue stenosis becomes rigid and doesn't have a blood supply, right? So, but that happened to my brother, and again, I didn't have the words for that for many years, but the whole thing and the family trauma, my mother's trauma, stuck in my mind. So that was, on a more of a subconscious level. And then when I was in college in the 1970s and I studied anthropology, and around the early to mid 70s is when Americans started talking about female genital mutilation, mostly in Africa and in North Africa and in Arab countries. But it was really focused, the conversation on sub-Saharan African countries. And I remember thinking and saying, well, we do that to boys. And the pushback was like unbelievable from my public health colleagues. I mean, that it's not the same. How could you even suggest that? And when I see that kind of a defensive reaction around anything, I think I'm onto something, right?
Yeah.
So it just stuck with me, and over the years I would mention it. And my son was born in 1980, and his father was from Argentina and intact, and which I hadn't given that much thought to, but it certainly was clear. We had about a 5-second conversation, which was, of course we wouldn't circumcise. We wouldn't do that. And it only came up because I had a friend who had struggled with that when she was pregnant, feeling that there would be pressure from her parents to do it. So I don't think it would have even been a conversation between us, but we're on the same page about that. And and even after that, over the next 18 years, my son grew up and we never talked about it, except I remember once he told me he had another kid in another friend of his who wasn't circumcised and everybody else was. And the conversation just kind of happened and went away. Mm-hmm. And then, so that was it's just matter of fact. And we didn't, and his pediatricians never mentioned it. He had practice of 3 Jewish pediatricians. I used to say they treated him just like he was normal, which he was, of course, right? So it just really was not an issue. And I feel so fortunate in retrospect because I see people struggling with this. It was never a struggle for me. I did what I 100% believe was right. I was on the same page with his father, and all the people we had caring for him, thought it was unremarkable, which it is. Why should you remark on somebody's body being intact, right? Yeah. Then when he was 18, we had been at a family gathering, and there had been a big discussion among all the men about circumcision. I don't even know how it came up. I wasn't in the room. And I heard them all laughing and yelling and very good-natured, everybody big ha-ha. And I walked in the room, probably taking some food in or something. And my son was standing there with his arms up in the air saying, "You guys just don't know what you're missing." And, I left the food and left the room, went back to the kitchen with my sister-in-law and everybody else. And the next day when we were driving back to New York, I said, "What was that about?" He said, "Ma, those guys were telling me, they were saying that not circumcising is a fad. How can leaving your body the way it comes naturally, how can that be a fad? How can the way people's bodies have been for, hundreds of thousands of years be a fad, right?" And then I said, "Yeah, you're right." Then we drive on, another half mile or something. He was driving and he looked over, he said, "By the way, I never thanked you and Dad for not circumcising me. Thank you so much." And it was like somebody had dropped me, 1,000 feet. I was like, I never had thought of it as something, even though I had an intact husband and had been with intact men, I never thought of it as something that affected men throughout their lives. And here was my 18-year-old son appreciating and knowing the value of his foreskin. And I had never had that conversation with anybody. So how old was I? 48. No, like a little younger than that, 46, 47. And I became an activist. I just said, wow, this is like way more than just a ridiculous thing or a mean thing to do to a baby. That's kind of how I thought. Why would you put a baby through pain? That's so stupid. That's so hypocritical that we think is terrible to do to girls, but we do it to boys. That had been the level of my awareness. And everything changed. Everything changed. And I started to really think about it. I'd always talk to people, and I encouraged cousins of mine not to circumcise their kids, friends, but always with that rationalization, that kind of rationalization before. Once I had, a first person gratitude, it changed everything. And I subsequently, I used to run a Medicaid health plan. I managed an insurance company for Medicaid patients, a nonprofit, for many years. And I decided sort of in the middle of that, I needed to do something different. So I went to law school I went to law school at night while I was working. And everything, I had decided to go to law school, and then my son thanked me about not circumcising him. And everything kind of came together. And everything I did in law school, practically everything, just kept focusing me in that direction of working on this issue as a human rights issue. It's a medical bioethics issue. It's definitely a legal issue. It's a marketing and public awareness issue. It's a health equity issue. All of these things were very important to me. I grew up in a family that was, they were civil rights activists and anti-war activists. So it just naturally became my focus over the next few years. And I wrote several papers in law school about it and presented them to my classmates and the faculty, and people got it. Lawyers get this, by the way, because it's irrefutably, from an ethical standpoint, a terrible thing to do. And then I started meeting people in the movement. I discovered the movement only when I started doing research when I was in law school. I wasn't surprised there were people working on it, but I didn't know them before. So some of the people that you mentioned to me, Sophia, Marilyn Milos, who lives in the Bay Area, and she really was the founder of the movement. And I met her and people who were running other very small organizations. And then Marilyn introduced me to someone who wanted to donate money to this issue, but wanted a larger infrastructure. So I was lucky enough to be able to bring it into another organization I ran called the Hudson Center for Health Equity and Quality. And he donated $1 million.
Wow.
And we were off and running. And I had, thankfully, I could organize and manage and administer things. But there was a whole team of people who had been working on this issue for 10, 20, 30 years. And I had them as my knowledge base, right? And still do. So that's how this all happened. And that was actually, I think the introduction you read said 2010, or 12 years or something. We have to update that. Impact America was actually founded in 2008. So we're in our 14th year, almost 15. So that's it. Long answer to a short question.
And I think a lot of people too feel like, it's painful, it's not necessary, and also don't realize that there can be lasting consequences.
There are always lasting consequences.
Yeah. And
even if it goes well,
yes.
The lasting consequences, you're living the male is living the rest of his life without an intimate body part that God or nature, take your choice, saw fit to put there. And it has a function, a form, and that function, because that's a pleasure organ and an organ of procreation, that function has to be pleasure. It has to be there, pleasure or facilitation of pleasure. That's why it has to be there. It's like food has to taste good or people wouldn't eat it, right? Yeah. Who would think of putting something in their mouth and chewing it and swallowing it if, in fact, people who have no taste buds have trouble, right? They have the urge of hunger, but food doesn't give them any pleasure or enjoyment. And without a foreskin, a man can have the urge, will have the urge, but will not get the full pleasure. And people like to argue against that. All I say is you don't have everything that nature intended you to have. Your experience is necessarily diminished.
Yeah, when I worked with the Bay Area activist, I made a friend, and he had been circumcised. I can't remember. I want to say it was like 18 or something. It was for a partner that preferred it, and he did it and regretted it. But it was interesting to hear his perspective of living with foreskin for 18 or so years and then not having it. And right. He kind of described it as he had seen the world in color and now he could only see in black and white. But if you have only ever known black and white, you don't know that you're missing something. You know? These men who are saying, oh, well, I'm fine, I had it done and I'm fine, and I experience pleasure when I have sex, but like they don't know to the extent that it could be and should be.
Right. And that is obviously true. Anybody who would tell you that's not true is just, in complete denial. I mean, if I lost 2 of my fingers, then I would be living the rest of my life missing 2 fingers and missing whatever those fingers could do for me, right? It's just logical, it's obvious. But the other part of it is that even men who are not even men who are experiencing pleasurable sex they don't, you're right, they don't know what they're missing. I'm sorry, I'm stumbling a little bit.
Okay.
But men there are so many men who are not experiencing pleasurable sex. They have damage beyond what a routine, whatever that is, circumcision would do. So if their frenulum, which is the part of the penis that ties the foreskin to the shaft of the penis and keeps it from flopping around, right? If that has been dug out, that is the most sensitive part of the penis. And if that has been ablated in a circumcision, you have tremendous scarring, often pain or ultrasensitivity where the frenulum was, but it's not the kind of pleasure that you would have. And then all kinds of cosmetic consequences, bent penis, things that men just haven't questioned, well, that's just the way my penis looks. And then they start reading and they say, that's a scar. That's not a naturally occurring dark ring. And their whole perspective changes. And for so many men, that's almost unbearable. I can see why people just don't want to think about it. I'm not sure I would want to think about it if it was me. I know I wouldn't want to think about it, but once you've realized it, you can't help it, right? Yeah. So it's so important for us to, and when, women will complain about their husbands, wanting to circumcise their baby, or they'll say that, it's really important to see that from the man's perspective. He's hearing, like you said, right? She thinks I'm damaged. She thinks I'm incomplete. Am I damaged? Am I incomplete? It's very complex.
Yeah.
And really important to kind of cover that waterfront with people.
Yeah, because it's like is your ego going to be bigger than protecting your baby? Do I have to prove that I am fine by circumcising my children?
Right.
Or can I say whether this should have been done or not, to me, I'm not going to do it.
I'm just not going to do it. Right. Let's just, and then there's always the argument well, I mean, obviously you can always do it later, right? Sometimes I think you're just into buying time. You think, okay, just get them to have the child there with them for a month, and they'll see that his foreskin didn't rise up in the middle of the night and strangle the family dog, right? Just let it be for a little bit, and there's a good chance they won't cut their child. Or obviously, the real thing is to not do it, and then the kid can decide when the kid becomes a man. And almost nobody would ever do it then.
Yeah, it's interesting that there was this at your family party, all the men kind of talking about it and in jest, joking.
Right.
Because it is a topic that doesn't come up very often, and it could be uncomfortable for people. So it really wasn't until I started educating and, doing intactivist work around it that I then started to hear the horror stories of, because I was made aware, like you said, all men have lost something if they're circumcised. But I got to hear the stories of even worse case scenarios of repeat surgeries, as they become of age and their penis grows and it's tearing, and and down to psychological. I've met many men who are either traumatized by the pain or just the idea of what happened, or that they confronted their parents who wouldn't apologize and could never get past that.
Yeah, it's very, very, very complicated. And I really think the same way I didn't realize, beyond just it's unnecessary and painful to do to a baby until that conversation with my son. I'm recognizing even now more and more how it impacts the entire family and the entire family constellation. I remember my mother coming home after having to hold my brother when they reopened his penis. And here she was, a few days postpartum, right? Having to hold her child and witness that. Because of course she didn't witness a circumcision. That would have been we don't let parents watch a circumcision, right? Because it's too horrifying, right? So it and then the repercussions for the blame, the recriminations, the defensiveness, even the apologies are inadequate, for somebody who is in deep grief and feels that, well, you're apologizing, but why did you go through with it? What was the reason? And, I have no doubt that even a parent who apologizes, that can be totally inadequate. I mean, how can you apologize for something so drastic? I mean, how can someone accept an apology for that? I mean, you just hope that the family is strong enough to get over it. But often there have also been other conflicts over it, many of them unspoken. So it impacts, we say it impacts the boy and the man he will become, and his future sexual partners, and potentially his entire family constellation, parents, siblings. And for each one of these things, I've heard hundreds of stories.
Yeah. It's not until you actually are open yourself and talking about it that then the stories come up.
Right.
Yeah.
And of course, as a midwife or as a birth worker, you can't possibly convey all of this and the complexity. So I like to just, boil it down to real simple stuff. The foreskin is there for a reason. Children look different from their parents. Every child looks different from his or her parents, and that doesn't demand an intervention. And this is your son's body and his body part, and he can always decide as an adult if he wants to do that, and almost nobody ever does, because it's a body part that was put there for his pleasure.
And it's actually safer to do it when you're older because you can have adequate anesthesia, and theoretically your penis has grown to its potential, and so they know exactly what they're removing.
They're cutting off, right? You're operating. People say, oh, it's just a little tiny flap of skin. Well, everything's tiny in a baby. That's like saying, I'm going to cut off his little toe because it's just a tiny little toe, right? Like a baby's heart is a tiny little heart, right? And so when you start attaching metal clamps to a tiny little penis, the possibilities for harm are devastating.
Could you go into a little bit of detail, because I know you had mentioned how the foreskin has function, and my understanding is it has a few different functions, because it depends. Obviously as a baby you're not having sexual experiences, that's for later, but it has so many functions of protective functions when you're a baby. Could you touch a little bit on that, what this is?
Sure. Well, the foreskin is attached to the head of the penis in a baby boy. And the foreskin detaches from the head of the penis, which is called the glans, Glans, over time. And there's a lot of misunderstanding because we live in a culture where most men are circumcised. There's a lot of misunderstanding and bad information about that. That often doesn't happen until adolescence. And you will read medical literature that says the foreskin should be separating by the age of 3 or 4 or 5. The average age of spontaneous foreskin separation is after 10 years of age. And that's because it doesn't need to be separated. That nature takes care of those things, right? So with the hormones of puberty, or earlier in some cases, it will separate and become retractable. So, and the function of the foreskin when it's attached is, as you say, protection, right? It protects the urinary tract from bacteria and germs. It protects the head of the penis from abrasion. And that's why it's there. Then the next function is pleasure. So masturbation or sexual intercourse or sexual activity, the foreskin naturally glides back and forth. Imagine a turtle if you removed all the skin around that turtle's neck and he could no longer retract his head into his shell, right? A foreskin, an amputated foreskin, a tight circumcision, as they call it, means there's no mobility in the skin of the penis. And that inhibits masturbation. It inhibits natural intercourse. It's also, the foreskin has eases intromission, eases entry, and provides lubrication. So intact men and their partners don't need to use artificial lubrication the way circumcised men do. Of course, all of this changes over the years, right? So pretty much no woman needs lubrication when she's 22 if she's turned on, but as time goes, that becomes an issue. And the penis also dries out over time. So picture if you remove a nail from your nail bed permanently, you pull it out, ouch. That nail bed will heal over time, but it heals, it becomes dry and hard, right? It's not like the skin on the other part of your finger, right? It's not sensitive like your fingertips. It becomes completely desensitized. So that happens to the penis. So a man 40, 50 years post-circumcision, the glands of his penis has been rubbing against his underwear every day for 50 years. And there's no wonder he has no sensation there, right? And then there are other functions of the foreskin that are less discussed, but immunological. The foreskin has Langerhans cells, which fight infections. I'm not an expert on this at all, but there is the secretion from the foreskin and the cells in the foreskin serve, they've discovered that your nasal mucus isn't just something dripping. It actually has immunological properties. Your saliva has immunological properties. So any secretion from the body is there for a reason. It's either there to shed bacteria and toxins, or it's there to fight them, right? And the foreskin smegma, which comes from the Greek word, the ancient Greek word meaning soap, is a cleansing substance. And people think smegma is a disgusting substance. Well, women have smegma too, and you just rinse it off, right? So all of those things are functions of the foreskin. Now, some people say there's 16 functions of the foreskin. If you start telling me there's 16 things, I just know I'll never remember them. But pleasure, protection, and lubrication are really or in the other order. Protection, pleasure, and lubrication are really the main functions of the foreskin. And without it, you've compromised all of those things.
And that for parents who are choosing to keep their babies intact, one thing I would hear is, oh, well, we had to do it later. And it was usually one of two reasons, that like he kept getting infections. And then the doctors were like, oh, well, you're not keeping him clean enough. We told you to retract the foreskin, clean underneath, which in turn leads to these infections. But these parents are thinking, we should have just done it then. He's going through all these infections now and all this pain. We're not doing a good enough job, when really they're having all this misinformation about how to properly care for intact
They
babies.
have created, the doctor or the nurse who forcibly retracted the child's foreskin, or the parent who did it because of that misinformation, has actually created the conditions for a circumcision, not to mention creating tremendous pain and anxiety for the child.
Can you speak a little bit about intact care and like the damages that come from proper care?
Right. Intact care is leave the penis alone.
Yeah. Easy.
Wash your baby, in warm water. You don't need anything. You don't need soap on anybody's genitals, any baby's genitals. They don't smell. You don't need soap. You never, ever, ever pull the foreskin back. You'll see around the tip of the foreskin, there might be a little dust or a lint from the diaper, or even maybe a little tiny white substance. If it gets to be too much, it could be a yeast infection, just like in your daughter, right? But you do not ever pull the foreskin back. People say, well, I just pull it back enough so I can look at the hole to see if the hole, it's like, wait a minute, are you looking at your daughter's urethra? Are you pulling her labia back and examining her genitals that closely? I hope not. And you shouldn't be doing it to your son either. So so people say, wash the foreskin like a finger from base to tip. And that to me just sounds like way too confusing. Just smush them around in the water, like, that's all you need to do.
Yeah.
Don't do anything
I've
else.
heard like clean what is seen. Like
That's
don't
fine.
go digging for something.
Right. And what is seen means you don't like try to see more than you can naturally see.
Yeah.
Clean what is seen is perfect. Yeah. And that's it. And then over time, you'll know. I mean, and the other thing is we use way too many cosmetics on ourselves and on our babies. So you don't need like bath gel, you don't need, disinfectant, and you don't need you should not be putting any child in a chlorinated swimming pool without perhaps putting Vaseline or some kind of barrier cream on their genitals before, and then wiping that off afterwards, because chlorine kills the natural bacteria in the body, and that's when you get an overgrowth of yeast. When a doctor tells you a child has an infection and needs to be circumcised, often what the doctor is looking at is yeast and not a bacterial or a serious invasive infection. It needs to be treated, but it needs to be treated with like an antifungal or liquid acidophilus. The other thing is, if you have a doctor who tells you he wants to give you steroid cream to have the foreskin separate from the penis, the answer to that is no, thank you, I'm out of here. If the child is urinating properly, you do not need to hasten that separation. It'd be like putting steroid cream on your daughter's nipples to get her breasts to develop sooner. It's exactly the same idea. The body knows what it needs to develop. And the body, the foreskin will retract normally. Never fall for that.
I was told by my son's urologist when he was a year that he should be retractable by a year. And luckily I was really educated, and I was like, what are you talking about? This information is so easy to find online. And she was like, I went to school for this. I'm like, that's why I'm so confused. Like, my husband just
terrible.
Totally left the room. He was like, oh God.
It's really a travesty.
Yeah.
And even the American Academy of Pediatrics, which is, an apologist for circumcision, to say the least, they have a brochure where they get the age wrong, but the principle is correct, where they say nobody should ever forcibly retract a boy's foreskin. And then they get the age wrong. They say it should be retractable by the age of 5, which is not 1, what your urologist said. But they do say nobody but the boy should ever pull his foreskin back. Now, there are things that can go wrong. There are yeast infections. Sometimes a child will have pain when the foreskin is beginning to separate, and parents need to be reassured that that's normal, unless it's really terrible. And then your struggle is to find a knowledgeable urologist. Sometimes there's ballooning, which is just when the skin is starting to separate. But most boys have no problem. And if you have something that comes up like that, you're far better off initially consulting with a consumer organization, an intactivist consumer organization like us, like intactamerica.org, or we have info@intactamerica.org is our questions, or through our website, or with Your Whole Baby, that has a Facebook page with great information on care for intact children. Go to them first. Unless your child is in a crisis, don't make the hospital or a doctor don't make that your first stop.
Yeah, I agree. I have a lot of people who call me for like, is this normal? Because you're in a relationship maybe where this man that you're with grew up without a foreskin. So he's like, even though he chose intact for his baby, he's like, I don't know what's normal.
People don't know, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And this is true of many things, with the human body, where everything is so pathologized, right? And the foreskin, doctors, we hear about it every day in a hospital emergency room. A mom takes her baby with vomiting, and the nurse or the doctor sees that intact foreskin, and before the mother could even know what's happening, they must have some special trick. They grab that child's penis and force the foreskin back, and now the child's got vomiting or an ear infection plus a wounded penis.
Yeah. And it happened so fast because I was doing all this education and activist work before I had children. And my son, he had to have 6 surgeries his first year. And one of them, he had retained urine after, and he wasn't able to pee for many days. And so we agreed to a catheter. And I remember being like, okay, is there somebody who's trained to do a blind catheter? I don't want any retraction. They're like, yep, no problem. I was like hovering over my baby, and it happened so fast, and he started bleeding everywhere, and
They retracted him?
retracted him. Yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So it's like so hard, even if you like know what to fight for
Right.
to make sure it doesn't happen.
Right. And we've had parents tell us that they were asked to leave. Somebody had hospital security called on them because they freaked out over that.
Yeah.
Yes, terrible. But it's just really important to educate as many people as possible so they go in there forewarned, and over time, you know, but it's just such a long process. So Intact America is embarking on a project right now to address three things: circumcision and solicitation, because we found that 94% of expectant moms are asked if they want to circumcise their child, and average number of asks was 8 times. And that goes from everything like, you're going to circumcise him, right? You know, don't forget to check the circumcision box. You know, all of those are solicitations. So we're going to encourage complaints from people who have been solicited. We are going to encourage complaints about circumcision damage, where this is not a malpractice effort. That's separate. People can pursue that if they want, but circumcision damage. And the third thing is forcible retraction. And we're collecting the information from parents and helping them to file complaints with the doctor who or nurse who did the deed, the solicitation, or the botch, or the retraction, and to the facility, also to the state licensing board or board of professional misconduct, as each state has a different name for an agency like that, and then to the Joint Commission, which is a national quality and equity organization. So we are just coding the database for that, and it'll be up and running in a couple of months. And again, info@intactamerica.org is your easiest way to talk to us about that. We have other ways of getting in touch with us on our website or Facebook page, but info@intactamerica.org. If you have any questions, if you want to help us with that project by doing some work in your own state, or if you just, want to weigh in with your experience.
Great. We'll make sure that's on the show notes too, so people can.
Great.
Yeah. Briefly, before we end, I'd love to touch a little bit on how this even came to be. Because I know, most people know about the Jewish religion and circumcision. A lot of people have a misconception of what the original circumcision was in the Jewish culture, and also then how did it come to be so mainstream in people?
Well, actually, the population, the largest circumcised population in the world is the Muslim population, because it's also done there. Unlike Jewish ritual, where it's the 8th day, a very prescribed ritual, it varies a lot among Muslim cultures. Sometimes it's done very early in life. Sometimes it's done with boys who are like 3, 4, 5 years old, and then sometimes it's like an adolescent rite of passage. But the United States is unique in doing this as a medical procedure done by doctors, the white coat, circumcisions. And that arose out of Victorian times, when in England and the US and other English-speaking countries, there was a phobia about masturbation. Masturbation was thought to dissipate a man's strength and lead to all kinds of diseases and problems. And so someone got the bright idea that if you inflicted pain on the penis, it would keep boys from masturbating. So circumcision began that way in the 1860s, 1870s. It also, then there were kooky doctors who, germ theory was not well understood at that time, who posited that the foreskin was the cause of all kinds of illnesses, like afflictions, tuberculosis, insanity, mental retardation, crazy theories that just began to chase each other, circumcision and these crazy theories. Then, pretty soon they discovered germ theory. So other rationalizations happened, like it was cleaner, right? And circumcision made its way into the medical profession with the advent, and you know more about this than I do, Sophia, with the advent of obstetrics as a specialization. And so and with the growth of hospital-based birth. So women who had their babies in hospitals in the early part of the 20th century were affluent women, and it was a terrible, this is an example of where having money and doing something prestigious actually damages you and impairs your health, right? So they were having babies in hospitals where they were being knocked out, immobilized. The child was being dragged out of them with forceps. Episiotomies became the name of the game. And then the OB is there with his scalpel, and the baby gets circumcised, because that was the way to show that the parents were really, up and coming. So circumcision took off in this country, by the 1930s, it was becoming more common. And then during the Second World War, a lot of men who had escaped the knife were circumcised by military doctors. Again, it became part of the culture, and where the rest of the world diverged. So in England, with the creation of the National Health Service, they just didn't want to pay for anything that wasn't necessary. And some influential doctors and midwives had exposed that circumcision was, if not harmful, was completely unnecessary. And also they understood the function of the foreskin and the natural time of separation. And so Britain stopped. Australia, New Zealand completely stopped, like in the 60s. Australia stopped, and the rate is, there's still some circumcision there, but it's fairly low. And Canada kind of went along the path of the US, but in the provinces where it's not covered under the provincial health system, their circumcision is very low in Canada. In provinces where it's covered, it's higher. But the US is the last country standing that most of American men are cut. Mm-hmm. And that is what keeps the assembly line moving. That's become normative here. And then the most horrifying thing, as we were talking about, is that even now when a child escapes the clamp or the knife at birth, there's a whole industry out there, urologists and even pediatricians, nurses in hospitals, who are just poised to attack that child's foreskin and keep the status quo, keep the assembly line going.
Keep all the myths alive,
Yep.
that it's cleaner, and that the parents are doing something wrong.
Well, then there's a whole other, world of information and ethics about this, because not surprisingly, because everything, in our country has nuances when it comes to race and social class. So we found in our surveys, Intact America has done a number of surveys, and we repeat them over time, that persons of color, mothers of color, are solicited more aggressively than white mothers, presumably for a couple of reasons. One is they might say no. That would be true of Latina mothers and Asian mothers. And the other is that these are, if in the case of Black Americans, they're populations where there's a lot of stigma and a lot of imputation of poor hygiene, that's historical, right? Poor people. And in fact, in this country, the history of circumcision, the poor immigrants in the 19th century were mostly Southern Europeans, Italians, Greeks, and they were, Irish. They weren't Southern Europeans, but they were poor, and they were intact. They lived in bad conditions. So they were among the dirty immigrants who came here with dirty foreskins. So there's a whole class bias. And you can see where people who are trying to integrate into this country could be influenced to circumcise their boys, even though it's not part of their culture.
Yeah, yeah. When you painted that whole picture, starting at like, women going to the hospital and what birth used to look like there, and sometimes still kind of does, and dragging the baby out and cutting the baby, it's just like, how was that ever a good idea? When you say it for what it really is.
Right, right. Oh, we sanitize it with all this terminology, right? In the name. And I was thinking about this the other day, we're so insurance dependent in this country. We refer to those things as benefits. Well, is circumcision a benefit in your health? Is that a benefit that your health plan provides? It's like, that's not a benefit of anything, right? Like, is that an assault that your insurance plan pays for? Is how I would put it, right?
Yeah, our terminology is so important, and you could just see like the marketing almost behind it.
Absolutely. And it is an assembly line procedure. A friend of mine who's an obstetrician in California who refuses to circumcise, he's participated in one when he was a resident and has never forgotten it and never done one since. And he told me the story of one of his colleagues who, when he brought up the subject, she said, a woman doctor, and she said, nope. She said, I can make a lot of money that way. Just line them up, and I go in there and I go chop, chop, chop. And think of all the RVUs. That's the relative value unit for billing. Think of all the RVUs I can accumulate.
Okay.
Yeah.
I have never seen one other than the one I looked online to see what circumcision was. A midwife I was studying with had recommended I go watch a Moyle perform one for one of her clients, just to like see how different it could be done at home. And I had a full panic attack on my way there, and I turned around. I was like, I cannot watch this. Even if it's supposedly like gentler, like I just.
How gentle is it to rip off part of the baby's penis?
I was like, no, we're trying to pretty it up with different terminology, like you said.
To play nice music. The other thing, I might have lost my train of thought. Never mind. Okay.
Well, this was great. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing your wisdom.
Thank you for exploring this, and I hope that you have other opportunities and other guests who can talk about other aspects of it. I think it's so important. The work you do is obviously incredibly important, and bringing this topic front and center, because I know your focus is the baby as well as the mom, right? Yeah. It's a terrible way for a mom to start off caring for a baby when she's incredibly stressed over having, a wounded baby. You have to do wound care on a newborn, and it's hard enough to have, a newborn and maybe other children around, and without having to do this. So
yeah, exactly. And we advocate for protecting her genitals in labor and birth, and just to hand the baby over, that doesn't make sense.
Right. Well, thank you again for having me.
Yeah, and another link I'll leave too for anyone listening is there's a great website called Sex as Nature Intends, I think is what it's called. And it is graphic. Do not look it up at work, but it has videos of what sex is like circumcised and intact, and the things that you were talking about with the lubrication and just how it is supposed to be and how it is beneficial for both partners. So yeah, so that will be in the show notes too.
Great.
Well, thank you again.
My pleasure.
Thanks everybody for listening. You can find us at Born Wild Podcast on Instagram. For inquiries or feedback, you can email us at bornwildpodcast@gmail.com. You can find me, Emma Ray, on Instagram at Emma Ray, REA.
Sophia at sophiabirth.com.
And me, Leah, at Bay Area Home Birth.
We would really appreciate it if you would rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. It helps us reach more people. And as always,
Stay wild.